Winter is a great restorer, the poet Edith Sitwell once wrote, and so also is Michael Engold's magnificent book, a work of deep learning and high ambition, reminding us of our wild and woolly half-Asian, half-European heritage, of our uncanny resilience and infinite capacity for hybridization and reconciliation, not to mention fission and fragmentation. Welcome to the royal ride, behind the golden curtains of the Byzantine power structure, where power wore silk slippers, and where ceremony was not just tradition, but also domination in disguise. Palace protocols and ceremonies in Byzantium is not just about royal etiquette. It's about a pageant where every bow, every robe, every incense cloud was a chess move on the board of politics, religion, and control. The Byzantines had worked ritual like it was psychological warfare, with a perfume coating and package of purple silk. If you're into imperial drama, divine choreography, and the most carefully stage-managed flexings of authority in the ancient world, this video is for you. Stay until the end and let me know. How are you feeling right now? Not what you think, but how you feel. Believe me, you'll be shocked by the answer. All right, let's get into it. In order to appreciate the protocols and ceremonies of the Byzantine court, you need first to leave behind the modern concept and ideal of formality and substitute for it orchestration of divine hierarchy. The great palace was arbitrary in nothing. From the second an ambassador kissed the hem of an emperor's robe, to the instant a courtier stepped into the marble halls, every gesture had been codified, not suggested, commanded. You weren't audience with the emperor. You were drawn into a heavenly drama, with him as the living image of Christ on earth. The Book of Ceremonies, composed under Emperor Constantine VII, is in reality less a manual and more a theatrical script. It didn't just tell people what they should do. It demonstrated how ritual could be used to manipulate time. When envoys crossed the thresholds of the Magnora Hall, that was not furniture they saw. It was hierarchies. Thrones lifted on segments of machinery. The curtains parted on a sigh of divine timing. Music filled the air. Not music played by men, but music played by automatic organs and mechanical birds. Sounds specifically designed to take the emperor's image to other unimaginable realms. And he didn't walk, he emerged. Byzantine ceremonial life was so much weaponized symbolism. The emperor's clothes were studded with pearls and embroidered with scenes from scripture. Even his footwear could be a form of status. No one except the emperor was allowed to wear purple shoes. Even the eunuchs, the most trusted members of the palace staff, appeared in specific uniforms and carried staves with a specific number of rings that signified their rank. Hierarchy was all around. Visual, sonic, kinetic. Foreign, sidial restraining orders. Ernaries did not only see the emperor, they were crushed by a full-body ballet of power. An envoy from Persia would enter the Chrysotriklinos, his nostrils assaulted by the scent of incense so intense it made him blink, listen to hymns in Greek that he didn't understand but could feel in the marrow of his bones, and see the emperor, his silhouette radiant with a golden nimbus, raise a hand as though not greeting him, but blessing him. They did not leave just impressed, but cowed. Within the empire, Rituals governed the year. Christmas was not just a feast, it was an imperial wheel. Backed by guards in cloaks of flame color, chanting clergy guided the emperor in procession to Hagia Sophia. At Easter, the emperor's kiss of peace was, in other words, theology in the flesh, as reassertion of his position as Pontifex Maximus of the Christian Roman world. The triumph wasn't an impromptu celebration when a general returned home victorious from battle. It was a script-driven entrance, light choreographed, music and crowd in place. Citizens filled the Mese, the main thoroughfare of Constantinople, not only to cheer, but to watch something like a cosmic realignment, a triumphant Christian general returning home to the Holy Roman Emperor, escorted by saints in mosaic, up above, blood-washed armor down below. Rituals were not merely repetitive, they were adaptive. The court could change ceremonies to make messages. An emperor being visited by an envoy from a defiant province could make the interview briefer, a choice of chairs less comfortable, or even host it in another room off to the side. A spatial insult that spoke louder than words. Protocol was speech without language. These rituals reached to the depths of the private realm. The empress's morning greeting was a small liturgy. Servants did not merely knock, they sang out. Chords were pulled in the order that the sun rose to reveal his vision, reflected in the mirrors, not his image, his vision. Each ceremony served to remind those attending that the imperial court was a reflection of heaven. Death didn't end the show. The burial of a Byzantine emperor was a ritual epilogue that surpassed the coronations in splendor and drew from old customs, such as the Roman triumph or the Roman imperial burials, that were also accompanied by such splendor. The body appeared in state, dressed in imperial garb, before a procession that snaked through streets filled with weeping subjects, chanting cleric and soldiers, clad in black. The point wasn't grief, it was change. The empire did not fall in sadness. It intuited death, swallowed it up whole, spit it back out, smelling of incense and strewn with icons, and appointed a new king, whose crown was placed on his head before the last one was even interred. The coronation of a new emperor was a ritual of rituals. It didn't simply bless a ruler, it reset the cosmos. Patriarchs set the crowns on foreheads with trembling fingers, not because of dread of the emperor, but because they were putting load of heaven on human skull. The people shouted and the ground shook as the Scholae Palatinae, legendary imperial guards, drummed their feet in unison in applause, and one man became a symbol, not flesh, but function. It was Hagia Sophia, the achingly sacred architectural symphony of Christendom, in which the crowning occurred, and every step, every chanted syllable was registered to memory by those present and immortalized in the organic whispers among the marble columns. In other words, power did not birth power in that moment. It was revealed. A coronation could proclaim a new emperor, but what he did was all in how he staged his presence. Everything he did in public mattered. Sitting was power. Standing was condescension. There was no such thing as walking next to someone. That pretty much never happened. Even silence had volume. If the emperor took a pause before addressing someone, that pause could reverberate louder than his words. silence became a weapon in the courts, and everyone at court held their breath for it. The Byzantine court, particularly in later centuries, was obsessed with space management, not rooms, but psychologically zoned. For the ambassadors, waiting in select chambers designed to maximize wonder or fear. Certain rooms were intentionally cold, others too ornate to be comfortable. The concept wasn't hospitality, but architecture as intimidation, and ruling over all was the emperor, who remained hidden until just the instant when that mystery became intolerable. And that's when he arrived, high up, backlit, bejeweled, and the room curved around him as though he were the time, and it a star. Inside the palace, protocol was theater of mirrors. Mirrors did not reflect the emperor. They multiplied him. There are some accounts that the throne room was lined with mirrored surfaces, all of them directed to make it appear as if one man were 100. The mechanical throne could ascend, spin, or play music. It would not be simply an emperor that a foreigner would behold, but prophecy, technology, and artifice fused into one place of blinding majesty. And that point was Byzantine power. Even the smell of the emperor was contrived. The palace put perfumers on the payroll the way modern states hire press secretaries. The emperor did not sweat. He emanated holiness. The incense that was burning next to him wasn't even coincidental. This was selected for doctrinal meaning. Frankincense, divinity, myrrh, sacrifice, rose, earthly glory. A single whiff of it, and a stranger would be immediately disarmed before a word was spoken. And then there was the language. Not just what was said, but what was sung. Most of the imperial communication happened in chant. The petitioners were introduced by eunuchs, and the voices of these officers were high-pitched and metallic, which made the names sound otherworldly. It was not General Niketas from Thrace. It was Niketas ton endoxotaton stratigontis thrakis, chanted like a psalm, resonating down marble corridors until it became as though a verdict from heaven. Every name, every title was a line in the empire's never-ending liturgy of power. Bureaucracy became ritual. Whenever someone was given an office, even the smallest of offices, it came with robes, oaths, a parade, and a gift. Getting a title was not administrative. It was sacramental. The recipient became a new person in a new name. Promotions in the empire were ordinations, and the robes, it was always the robes, told the tale. They came in layers. The higher up you went, the more people layered up. Banning the wearing of one garment or another may be poor form, but when some of Zarpalas's pupils spent hours in her studio giggling on the floor because their dresses were so heavy with beadwork or embroidery, too ornate to be walked in without assistance, these clothes were not fit for purpose. They were burdens of glory. The palace pulsed with the flows of the seasons. On great feasts, the emperor slept not in his own chamber. He was led to a part of the palace prepared for that feast. His bed was moved. His staff changed uniforms. The palace now turned toward the liturgical year. Time itself bowed to ritual. The emperor's habits were not decisions based on personal tastes. They were public events, full of significance. And yet, all this grandiosity had a smudged edge. Protocol could separate as easily as rays. Emperors were commonly captives of their own divinity. Others weren't even permitted to appear in public with hair uncovered. It was too private, too exposed. Meals were consumed in a choreographed silence, performed by servants who watched but never spoke. To be emperor was to be watched all the time, watched and praised, and still totally alone, and behind it all were the eunuchs, those who were surgically severed from lineage, rendered perfect servants of the palace. They weren't merely helpers. They were ceremony master elite operators, trusted as dynasties could never be. These men held great power with the guardianship of the sacred bubble on earth that was the imperial presence. No one learned the codes of behavior better than they. One wrong word or misstep, and an entire ceremony would be derailed. Eunuchs didn't just walk, they glided. They didn't talk, they issued statements as incense, slow, fragrant, premeditated. The emperor's interaction with the church, too, proceeded through hyper-ritualized channels, bagging himself the patriarch of Constantinople. When the patriarch of Constantinople came to the palace, it was only on tentorial feast days that he did so, attended by a certain number of people, with scrolls, with performances of keen script. The emperor kissed icons with a rhythm that seemed both pious and commanding. He did not kneel. He bowed, a subtle signal to all around him that he was not beneath the church, but beside it. For theology, he continues, the Byzantines danced. They didn't debate, and even punishment had a ceremonial script of its own. A deposed official didn't merely turn out of office, but was sometimes publicly divested of his robes, a visual unmaking of status. We can chisel his name off a list and erase his image from a mosaic, and still this will be all in the nature of rite. Nothing was done in rage. It was cold, orderly, holy humiliation. You weren't just punished. You were ritually deleted. Everything, the smallest gesture, was theater. And not all superficial theater, cosmic theater. To watch the emperor lift a chalice was to watch the empire offering itself up to God. To witness the empress distribute coins to the poor was to see the mercy of empire encoded in gesture. Byzantium wasn't about symbols for the heck of it. It did symbols because it thought reality was symbolic. The palace was not a home, it was a temple of meaning. Everything that happened in the Byzantine palace was curated, not only written, but architecturally designed to influence behavior. Floors were frequently marble mosaics that replicated footsteps in a manner that rendered movement ultimately naked and purposeful. Nobody could sneak or shuffle. You walked like you were somebody because the floor would gossip about flaws. Doors didn't creak. They boomed or whispered, depending on the person's rank entering. Even silence had a signature. In some halls, this silence formed a pressure, the vacuum of noise weighing so much it curved a person's spine. Music was not background, it was a participant. The palace had its staff of trained chanters, and their job wasn't to entertain, but to uphold the mood. They weren't singing in human time, they were singing in divine time. Slow, circular, meditative. Their melodies were made in the image of eternity. Some of the modes were worn in front of the emperor only. A foreign diplomat might not know the language, but they be aware of the change in tone, of the extension of notes, the way atmosphere itself bowed toward the emperor's proximity. Colors weren't decoration, they were emotional weaponry, but purple was the emperor's alone. Not lavender, not violet, but the deep royal purple that came from dyeing with murex shells. The method was labor-intensive, and the price off the charts, grotesque. It was not fashion, it was monopoly. Whoever was found wearing it without permission could be killed. Gold wasn't simply worn, it was mirrored. Gold mosaics, gold robes, golden light spilling down from concealed oil lamps behind carved screens. It established an environment in which the emperor seemed to be outside of time itself, with time bouncing off his clothes. The ceremonial meals were power plays as much as celebrations. The emperor never ate food the first time. A vassal did. Poison was always a risk. Dishes arrived in symmetrical processions, each one an analog to a biblical emblem or an imperial allegory. Lamb signified sacrifice. Pomegranates were symbols of imperial unity. A lot of seeds, one fruit. Sometimes the bread was stamped with imperial seals, for the bread that the emperor himself consumed was to be branded with his image. He literally ate power. Then he served it to his guests and allowed them to have power sandwiches. Guests were placed based on Byzantine precedence tables, not just general social rank, but their rank within the imperial way of looking at the world. A general could find himself sitting beneath a court eunuch because the eunuch was closer to ritual, and the closer you were to ritual, the more you trumped anyone who had distinguished himself in battle. That's how seriously they took hierarchy. They effectively turned space into scripture. Even the animals in the palace served some ritual purpose. Lions, real and mechanical, stood sentry in some halls. There were even trained peacocks that roamed certain courtyards as living symbols of eternity and resurrection. Caged songbirds were kept near the guest chambers to soothe or disturb. In accordance with species, all life within the palace walls had been aestheticized. You weren't visiting a home, you were touring a celestial museum of sorts. The liturgies were like no other in the empire, in the imperial chapel, while other churches also had services for the faithful. Here the service was itself part of imperial identity. There were specific chants for when the emperor would enter. He took his vigils on boards that had been consecrated by hundreds of years of service. He not only received communion, he performed it on behalf of the empire. His gestures corresponded to those transcribed into iconography for Christ. His manner was the Gospels. The empire didn't have to ask if God approved. It staged. His approval in drama, ceremonial journeys, were nothing less than extravagant. When the day came for the emperor to leave the palace, it was a spectacle that was years in the making. Roads were swept, bridges were secured, villages on the route had been warned in advance and provided with lists of behavior. No sudden gestures, no loud voices, no spontaneous interaction. They didn't greet the emperor. They became scenery in his sacred progress. The imperial carriage was designed to float noiselessly along when drawn by horses groomed each day with oils and perfumes. When emperors rode in galleys down the Bosphorus, those galleys were painted to look like moving churches, religious and dynastic symbols waved from banners. Priests would sometimes join the passage, singing psalms as incense burners swung from the sides of the boat. The emperor's station was under the dome-shaped canopy, Hagia Sophia's movable echo. The water, wind, and flame all conspired to prove him, literally, a walking sanctification of the state. The people watched, and to watch was an act of worship. Byzantines didn't see the emperor as a Hollywood celebrity. They saw him as a theological enigma. His face was stamped on coins, mosaics, and icons, not because the emperor was a narcissist, but because his face, his body, performed as a visual affirmation of divine order. To see him was to feel history gathering itself into fate. This wasn't superstition, it was structure, a world in which meaning folded in upon itself ad infinitum, and in which every public act was a liturgy of survival. The emperor's birthday was not a private event. It was a national acknowledgement. The court staged reenactments of his early years, including his education, military instruction, and even coronation if he'd lived long enough to rule. These were not nostalgia plays. They were political memoirs on the move. By controlling the narrative of the emperor's life, the palace upheld his myth. And myths were how you kept insurrection asleep in Byzantium. Every little thing even felt laden with ceremonial gravity. When the emperor bathed, and yes, he did bath, the process was a ritual. The water was blessed. The towels with imperial crests embroidered on them. The bath itself was modeled after a small baptistry. Attendants recited psalms. Even the washing of the body was thought of as representative of the moral regeneration. The emperor wasn't merely washing away dirt. He emerged rejuvenated, nearly transfigured, now to return to the stage of divine rulership. Even the weather was seen as commentary. If there was a solar eclipse during a procession, the whole ceremony could be stopped and done again. A few days later, the equivalent of editing past events. Lightning during a coronation was a portent to be feared, but also potentially spun as divine approval, depending on how the clergy read it. Rain at the time of an empress's wedding could be a sign of fertility, or a form of judgment, or not. The story could be reconfigured. What mattered was control. The empire did not just direct events, it managed interpretations. The empress had her own, equally elaborate rituals. She attended charitable events, particularly concerning widows and orphans. But these were not mere acts of charity. They were expressions of dynastic fertility and moral superiority. When she stepped into an orphanage, she wasn't there to help children. The purpose was maternal empirehood. Her robes were lighter than the emperor's, but hardly less deliberate. Pearls formed constellations. The Virgin Mary was suggested by embroidery. She didn't walk. She appeared. The wedding of a Byzantine emperor could not be conducted in private. It was a blood and empire ritual, carefully scored so that even the bride's tears had their cues. The search for an empress could last a matter of months, or in some cases, years. Imperial brides were not selected only for beauty and lineage. They were chosen for their symbolic power. Was she born into a prominent Armenian family? That's a message to the provinces of the East. Was she a Slavic princess? That's diplomacy with a veil and dowry. Was she the daughter of some general? That's the military getting a message. You're not forgotten. When this future queen passed through the palace doors for the first time, she didn't just walk. She was greeted like a relic. She was carried on processions from the city gate, in a chariot, or under a pall held by veiled court women. Musicians performed, eunuchs chanted her name, along with divine monikers. Soldiers in ceremonial armor escorted her in rhythmic column. She wore an outfit from her body down to her head that was carefully selected by the emperor's family, not her own. For from that instant, she was one with the empire. The marriage itself was a holy theater of twin sovereignties. As a bridegroom, yes, but also as Christ's proxy, the emperor in the presence of the patriarch, the empress, with her face covered in white or golden silk, did not say a word. Her silence punctuated the ceremony. She didn't need to speak. The presence was the confirmation. Rings were not slipped onto fingers, but onto buffers dictated by protocol. It was a ceremony with various stages: the public blessing, the private anointing, the walk to the bedchamber, done in front of some witnesses. The empire was not a trust in words. It trusted ritual. That first evening, consummation, was never truly private. Chamberlains and eunuchs were in attendance behind the bed to record that this was consummated. In some instances, they even checked for evidence of consummation the morning after. The reason wasn't scandal. It was legitimacy. An emperor could not leave doubts about his heirs. Fertility was not biology. It was dynasty insurance, and it was watched like a sacred sacrament. From that point forward, the empress had her own procession route. She had her own audience days, usually Sundays, when she'd sit in a semi-public chamber draped in purple trimmed with pearls, flanked by her court ladies, while ambassadors and petitioners paid her homage. She blessed with upraised hand, never touching the recipients. Touch was power. Too much, and it would leech the mystique away. The birth of an heir would cause the empire to explode in choreographed celebration. Not chaos, not joy. Celebration, choreographed. Bells were heard to ring in a certain order. In the more privileged parts of the city, fires would be burned only in the quietest areas. People flocked to certain places. The baby prince was presented swaddled in cloth with golden eagles and kissed by the senior-most court eunuch before being turned over to the emperor. That moment, the handoff, let's call it, was depicted in paintings, mosaics, and court poems for generations. One gesture, eternal significance. But even that birth did not ensure the succession. Strictly speaking, the Byzantine throne wasn't inherited. Legitimacy was consolidated through ritual. A child could be declared porphyrogenitos, born in the purple chamber, a room specially built in the palace with purple marble to give birth, where imperial children were born. That label was power. To be porphyrogenitos was to be born of legitimacy, reared not as a child, but as an emblem. Every toy, every book, every caretaker, all had been engineered to promote the walking ritual of the future. Education was ceremonial too. Imperial boys studied scripture and rhetoric and law, and most lastingly, precedent. Unfortunately, they didn't learn to think for themselves. They were trained in how to do continuity. when they committed to memory the speeches of their emperors of yore. They were not doing it for the sake of the eloquence. It was about reincarnation. An emperor, who was as he should be, was not an innovator. He brought the golden age back. If an emperor died without evident heirs, they became urgent. The ceremonies, and also the quiet violence. The court might turn into a theater of ghost rituals, repetition blessings, added processions, sudden encounters in clandestine chapels. Simple and easy. Create an illusion of a smooth transition, even if panic was clawing behind the curtain. Palace didn't quibble if a general or bureaucrat seized the throne. It did nothing but crown. If the performance stood, the people honored the result. Power was not grabbed in Byzantium. It was enacted into being. This, in turn, meant the usurpers knew the rules of ritual better than anybody. The man who marched on Constantinople with an army did not win with swords only. He had to enter Hagia Sophia at the right time, to be greeted by the clergy with the appropriate liturgical formula, and to have the crown placed on his brow while incense swirled around him in a concentric three-stroke wave. Without those measures, even winning reeked of treason. There were even instances in which emperors were rivals, one on the throne in Constantinople, the other in the provinces. It wasn't about whose troops were bigger, but whose rituals struck the public as more persuasive. Were the people going to buy the coronation? Did the coins bear his face? Was the name of the clergy chanted in the divine liturgy? If yes, he ruled. If he didn't, he fell, undefeated, perhaps, on the field. On this hair's breadth between belief and performance hung so much of the edifice of Byzantine rule. That is why the palace trained more than guards, but ceremony specialists, men who knew when every curtain opened, every candle was lit, every procession took place. These weren't functionaries. They were high priests of the imperial mirage. If they were, then they had gotten it wrong, and the illusion broke. And once the divine mask was shattered, it was difficult to repair, and diplomacy became a ritual too. Upon the arrival of foreign envoys, they were put under surveillance, not as prisoners, but as guests of a stage play. Everything they saw, heard, touched, it was all scripted. They were given special foods to eat, which were frequently symbolic. Pomegranates, again, were popular. Honey and walnuts for unity. Fish, not meat, for peace. They were led down hallways that recounted tales of Roman domination in every fresco. The aim was to impress, but also to befuddle. Mystery was what Byzantine diplomacy was all about. If a Frankish envoy departed bemused but impressed, the empire counted it as a win, and it worked for centuries. As kingdoms rose and fell in bloody conquest, Byzantium stood firm, not on iron, but upon the incense and silk, the marble and movement of its worship. Ritual kept up with advertised continuity. Ritual made believe in eternity, and for more than a millennium, the illusion lasted. Betrayal had not brought down Byzantium. It triggered a ritual. The name went first. Traitors weren't shouted down with fiery outrage by the empire. It erased them. Mosaic eyes were gouged out. Epitaphs chipped away with surgical precision. What was rewritten was history, not as an addition of chapters, but as an erasure of presence. The ritual of erasure was exact. The face of a deposed emperor could be erased from coins using acid, not melted, only melted enough to erase the features, leaving an empty ghost of where authority smiled. And if the revolt was public, well, here was the response, and it was ossified public theater. The rebel was led, not in chains, but in silent solitude, along the Mesi, the principal street of Constantinople. People didn't scream. They watched. They interpreted. Now and then, rebels were made to walk backwards, reversing their rebellion against divine order. They sometimes would be dressed in mock imperial vestments that were purple turned inside out and turned power upside down as well. Punishment was a ritual itself. People weren't blindings down in dungeons. They happened in chapels. The insurgent would be taken before an image, force a kneel, and disappear. It was brutal, but not chaotic. There were prayers. There was incense. The ritual of cutting was covered in liturgy. For if the body had sinned when it usurped an untrue authority, by the body must false authority be expiated. Even mercy was ceremonial. A rebel could be dispatched to a monastery, there to have his head shaved before witnesses, accompanied by a special chant marking his return to spiritual submission. That wasn't exile. That was liturgical exile, when emperors themselves started to stumble into paranoia, into madness. The palace bent. Insanity was not insanity. It was swallowed up by the symbology. When an emperor ceased to make public appearances, absenting himself both from sight and from light, his absence was accounted for as divine withdrawal, meditation, the development of a new holiness. Just in the second, even after he began howling at invisible demons, remained addressed as Basileus, sung about in hymns, because for him to be stripped publicly would have threatened the liturgical time of empire. Instead, the palace concocted an alternative narrative about his illness. Power was too divine to be allowed to blush, and if the tree had to be removed, it was done in the dead of night. The emperor would be quietly whisked away from the palace, usually with the excuse that he was being taken for protection. There would be a new ruler by dawn. By the morning, banners were switched, coins were minted, and the rest of the public was supposed to believe that the transition had been the plan all along. The empire does not recognize crisis. It accepted only a ritual updating of the roster. This protocol even held during civil war, when the factions fought among themselves inside the city. Clergy still chanted. Eunuchs were still opening doors at certain hours. Candles still burned in the emperor's name, even if two men were vying for the title. Ritual didn't stop for chaos. Ritual outlasted it, because Byzantium didn't merely reign in protocol, it survived on it. The most frightening example of this was the empire's treatment of prophecy. Comets, earthquakes, and rumors of apocalyptic dooms all were not read through a lens of panic, but of protocol. The court had assigned astrologers and dream readers. When Halley's comet streaked over Constantinople in the 11th century, the palace was not shaken. It had a hymn composed, rearranged a liturgy, conducted the equivalent of a march through the streets, candles in the sky, prayers in essence against the void. The message was clear. Even the stars fall to our right, and at times, emperors courted disaster just to be able to manage it. Public penance, for instance, was a fearsomely calculated ritual. An emperor entangled in scandal, sexual, political, or military, could come to the patriarch in Hagia Sophia and bow before him, not privately, publicly, with feet bare, his robe rent, dust on his head. But this wasn't surrender, it was domination in the guise of humility. For the crowd, gazing upon the humbled emperor, also gazed upon his power, the capacity to make himself small and still reign. It wasn't sincerity, it was choreography, and it worked. Byzantine protocol also ensnared enemies of the state abroad. When barbarian chieftains or Muslim emirs dispatched envoys, the court didn't reply in kind. It countered with over-preparation. Less rinsed-out newcomers were met at the gates by silver-robed officials and ushered through 30 rooms before getting so much as a glimpse of the emperor. One envoy said they walked through an entire hallway with wax statues that were standing still in real poses. Silence. Terror. He didn't know which figures were living. That was the point. Byzantium hoped that they would make visitors question the nature of reality. Presents were carefully selected for their psychological impact, not value. Meaning, a little case, fragment of a splinter of the true cross in olive wood was worth more than gold. Or a cloak that's woven with scenes from the book of Daniel, a reminder that kingdoms pass or fall unless they're protected by divine law. The empire's diplomacy was psychological warfare with gold ribbons. Even court treachery, poisonings, assassinations, was forced to conform to ritual. An unexplained body was not left unidentified. That sword was anointed, exhibited in a chapel, and then buried with honors, but the eulogy would be anemic, empty, bereft of the usual flourishes. That was the court's cryptic stage whisper. We remember, and will never mention this again. All of it, the betrayals, the upheavals, the whispered conspiracies behind marble walls, all of it was captured by ceremony. There were no accidents, only transitions, no guilt, only divine rebalancing. The more you were a character in a play whose script was older than recall and longer than an almanac, that's why the most trusted figures in the court weren't soldiers or generals. They were masters of ritual, the protospatherios, the preoppositus, the protovestiarios, all titles of nothing much beyond the palace, but in the gold-tiled palaces, they were everything. These men didn't need swords. They wielded authority through series. If any of them skipped a step, altered a phrase, miscounted a candle, the empire knew. That's how closely calibrated the machinery was. It would not be an exaggeration to claim that the empire had more faith in ritual than men. 29. Emperors died. Generals defected. But the typicon, or the liturgical code, survived. It was copied, studied, annotated. It was not law, it was reality. Optional reading, the Book of Ceremonies. It was a survival manual masquerading as one, and so Byzantium endured, not by being invincible, but by being believable. The great palace of Constantinople was not one building. It was a maze of performance spaces, a living being made of corridors, chambers, courts, porticos, all tuned to modify perception. No one was allowed to go into the palace and to the emperor. That would have been like starting at the final act of a divine drama. You had to go through a symphony of thresholds. Each room didn't simply go off somewhere. It said something about you, roughly where you were standing, in terms of the center of the world. The entire floor plan was a hierarchy. You began at the chalky gate, a grand, bronzed entrance filled with religious mosaics, backed not only by soldiers, but by the statues of victory and piety. It was hardly a door, more of an overture. You agreed on the way in. You were entering a different world, different rules. Then came the sequence. Which way? Depending on who you were, and what you wanted, and what the palace wanted you to feel. They might be led through endless colonnades. Such long, reverberating walks, also meant to stretch time and puncture ego. When you walked in the reception chamber, you no longer felt like a guest. You felt like a speck. And then, when the curtain parted and you saw the emperor on a rotating throne surrounded by mechanical lions and golden walls, your insignificance was not a feeling, it was a fact. The palace was bristling with mechanical marvels. Lions that roared, birds that chirped, thrones that rose. This wasn't magic. It was strategy. Technology served awe. The emperor did not have to crook a little finger. All his kingdom advanced with him. Apparatus embedded in their structure reacted to unseen triggers. Pressure plates, pulleys, weights, and built-in air pressure systems. A throne could hiss with steam and ascend in the middle of a speech. Curtains could draw without a hand touching them, and you didn't ask whether the emperor was divine. The walls had already spoken the answer to that, and along came the Hagia Sophia, not merely a church, but the Byzantium's showstopper piece in terms of ceremonial space, constructed to overpower, to squash ego, to bewilder you about the fact that you were inside or under the sky. Its dome seemed somehow to float, like a moon fastened with light. Between them, light itself was ritualized there, from windows let in with deliberate slants, timed so its rays would hit gold mosaics at the propulsion of hours, gilding halos around things. The empire would see. Did you see them? What was going on inside Hagia? Sophia was more than just worship. They were cosmic alignment. The emperor didn't proceed through the front doors, but through a side hall, known as the imperial gate. It was opened only for him. And no, not even the patriarch employed it. The omphalos is the circular marble base of the altar, where the emperor knelt. It wasn't just a symbolic presence there. It was theatrical astronomy. The sun, the dome, the incense, the chant, all revolving around one man. The structure itself exhaled ritual. Floors gleamed with porphyry and serpentine marble, set in a manner that made you walk a certain way, not forward, but spiraling, turning, circling like a pilgrim or a planet. Columns weren't symmetrical. Some were brought in from remote temples, implanted with imperial memory. Each stone had been somewhere, had stood for something, and now stood as a willing servant to the empire's holy geometry. Even beyond palace gates, architecture was subject to protocol. The Miase, Greek, Mesi Odos, the central street of Constantinople, was no mere thoroughfare. It was a ceremonial artery, triumphs, processions, imperial decrees, everything coursed through this marble conduit, its hideous arcades, statues, and colonnades standing in muted witness to the passage of lifetimes. The intention on the street was to enhance the movement. Hooves clopped louder, feet echoed wider. Crowds didn't just gather, they performed awe. Monuments weren't only commemorative, they were didactic. The column of Justinian, for instance, depicted the emperor in martial splendor, but it loomed over the city, holding a cross in one hand and a globe in the other. That wasn't decoration. That was a billboard of divine right, a vertical sermon in stone. Each palace annex served a ceremonial purpose. The Daphne, he said, was for summer receptions, the Magnora for diplomatic pageant, the Chrysotriclinos for coronations and nighttime rituals. They had different acoustics, different lighting, different marble combinations intended to guide not just the eye, but the ear. When a chant echoed differently from chamber to chamber, it alerted the audience to the fact that the emperor was differently perceived. Echoes weren't accidents, they were effects. Underneath everything, sculpturally speaking, was space, actually passageways, underground tunnels linking main buildings through which officials could pass unobserved, priests could arrive unnoticed, and emperors could disappear as required. Byzantium knew that one aspect of power is the ability to materialize and dematerialize with a sense of divine timing. If people couldn't anticipate your next move, they chalked it up to something more than mortal strategizing. Water would run under the palace in huge cisterns, not only to feed the city, but as a symbolic tether. The city sat on living water. It was a piece of the myth. Constantinople, the city of the prophecy, fed from below and lit from above. Even the walls were not just defense, they were ceremonial. Triumphant entrances through the Golden Gate were planned and rare, for emperors arriving home from wars, for newly crowned emperors. It was the city itself that performed the event. Citizens stood where told. Bells rang when triggered. It was not a party. It was a liturgy. And when a building was damaged by fire or earthquake, the restoration was not simply architectural. It was ceremonial cleansing. The emperor would rededicate in it a public rite that included processions, acclamations, and a chanted blessing. Rebuilding wasn't an act of fixing. It was righting the spiritual equilibrium that architecture had held. Byzantine architecture was designed to stir rather than stagger the senses. It was trying to teach the soul, for the purposes of being made to look reverent, to condition behavior. You didn't walk into the palace as a foreigner to adapt. You walked in as a foreigner to submit. And, in doing so, Byzantium won the battle without even unsheathing a blade. Everything, every column, every echo, every slant of light was in on the dance. You weren't in a building. You were in a machine. And what the machine did was meaning, which is why, even when emperors collapsed, when the treasury ran dry, when armies came and went, the buildings survived to tell the story. The empire might lose land, lose battles, even lose emperors. Just so long as the performance went on, the illusion of eternity survived. And sometimes, illusion is more potent than truth. In Byzantium, theology wasn't argued about in books. It was paraded. Heresy was not only wrong, it disturbed the empire's ritual rhythm. The state wanted theology to behave, not because it feared truth, but because it feared anarchy. Truth was negotiable, ritual was not. So, when the empire had doctrinal strife, on iconoclasm, on monophysitism, on Nestorianism, it didn't hurry to reason. It reached for ritual. An emperor charged with heresy did not argue in his own defense. He summoned a council, not a meeting, a show. Those ecumenical councils weren't conjured up by brain activity. They were imperial objects. Delegates did not come to discuss, but to chant slogans, sign creeds, and signal orthodoxy in gestures. The goal wasn't persuasion, it was victory by applause. Take the Council of Nicaea. It didn't refute Arianism with reason. It inundated it with ritual. The Nicene Creed wasn't just written, it was a performance. Quote in Mass, carved in stone, sung by choirs throughout the empire. Heresy didn't go away because it lost an argument. It vanished because it was expelled from the ritual script. If your belief couldn't be chanted, processed, embroidered, or incensed, it was foreign. Iconoclasm was the most dramatic of all doctrinal quarrels. The empire writhed not at the level of images, but at that of visibility. Could the divine be seen? Could it be portrayed? Emperors such as Leo III said no, and saw icons destroyed. But the resistance, it turns out, was not merely theological, it was ceremonial. Iconodules, iconophiles, or defenders of icons didn't conceal their paintings. They processed with them. They kissed them publicly. They cried for them in candlelit vigils that blurred the line between grief and spectacle. When icons were reinstated under the Empress Theodora, it was not merely policy, it was a moment of universal healing. The renovation was announced at a liturgy. Tens of thousands of people marched through the city, carrying icons high like recovered relics. It wasn't just that the people were celebrating, they reenacted victory. The ritual was known as the triumph of orthodoxy, and it was soon established as an annual ceremony. Yes, doctrine had won, but only because it had better choreography, and every emperor, no matter his faith, was forced to genuflect to that rhythm. An orthodox emperor could not just condemn a heretic. He had to do it by means of a chain of rituals, a formal curse in the hippodrome, a public burning of the offending texts, and a symbolic cleansing of the palace with incense and hymn. The empire was not scrubbed clean by decrees. It was washing itself with smoke and sound and spectacle. Monks were a critical part of this theological drama. They weren't quiet. They were thunderous. When doctrine was threatened, they poured into the streets, black robes waving, naked feet on marble, railing out at emperors. Some shaved their heads into crosses, led others by the painted icons which were attached to their breastplates. They made their own bodies into ritual objects. Arresting them merely upped the spectacle. A whipped monk served as a relic. His sores were seen as a divine commentary. The imperial shaping of doctrine was physical forcible. Church councils could only be convened by the emperor. They were seated on thrones surrounded by bishops, not just in military garb, but theological accoutrements, cloaks embellished with scenes from the gospel, rings with the names of apostles, crowns etched with the cross. The emperor wasn't merely in attendance. He was a walking argument for orthodoxy. Even texts of theology were given in set pieces. There was no quiet publication of a new creed. It would be read out in two parts, in Hagia Sophia, with a standby choir interrupting as necessary. Then it was sung through the city by bands of young men who carried banners on which verses were painted. They were sent to provinces neatly wrapped in silk, sealed in wax, and blessed before they went. The faith wasn't spread. It was used. Dissenters from the dogma, once anathematized, were not just banished, they were ceremonially expelled, which makes you think that at one time you had to belong in order to be ceremonially expelled. Their names were taken off church diptychs, lists of the living and the dead, who are singled out for prayers during liturgy. To be erased from the diptych was to die a worse death. It was spiritual death. A few monks lodged protests by putting heretics' names back in, smuggling them into the altar, then disappearing before retribution. Even resistance had ritual, and the clergy, oh, the choreography of the clergy. Bishops with high rank had greater settling arrangements, and lesser ones resembled ranks and deal in court nobles, swingage, incense bearers swung according to the rank. A deacon would adjust his chant pitch according to who was listening. When the patriarch was approaching to speak, his voice was prefaced by an individual rising hum of subdeacons, a speaking ramp for conning the words over to themselves ere they should reach ordinary mortal ear. Theology during Holy Week was an emotional roller coaster written out in 7 acts. The emperor took part not as a believer among believers, but as the center of cosmic redemption. He didn't just witness a reenactment of the crucifixion. He would stand in front of the processional cross flanked by golden-robed officials, sometimes unshod and always holding a candle. For every pace he walked, there were hundreds of priests, guards, eunuchs, and singers. The city itself flowed around him, one guiding form. It wasn't empathy, it was orchestration. And yet, the choreography was potentially fatal. When the emperor overstepped the firm boundary of a doctrine, be it monothelitism or the deals with Rome, ritual backlashed. Liturgy turned into protest. The people would not say the name of the emperor in the Eucharist. That in itself was terrifying. It broke the spell. A congregation that kept silent was a sign that the universe had gone off key. The emperor might have been naked, which is why emperors so often relented, not out of weakness, but out of ritual necessity. Better to capitulate than to bring the silence. Better to tweak theology than to have your name disappeared in the holiest moment of the liturgy. That omission was louder than any rebellion. It wasn't treason. It was disintegration. But the empire also held renewal ceremonies. When orthodoxy was reinstated, churches were reconsecrated, choirs retrained, robes rewoven. It wasn't going to be sufficient just to say the faith was true again. The corpus of ritual had to be re-sewn, and people bought it, not because they read it, but because they lived it. That's how Byzantium dealt with faith, not in the end, but in the redistribution. Theology bent like incense smoke, twisting, curling, sometimes cloying, but still moving through the chamber of ritual. And it was in that chamber, not the monastery, not the seminary, that belief hardened into law. An imperial anniversary in Byzantium wasn't exactly a party. It was a reenactment of eternity. When an emperor reached the halfway point of a decade, 2 decades, or half a century on the throne, the celebration wasn't just for his rule. It was for the ongoing alignment of the empire with divine order. Each year lived was another that the universe had held together. The sun had not fallen. Hagia Sophia's dome had not cracked. The body of the empire, embodied by the emperor, had not bled. And this was going to take a spectacle. The anniversary commenced with processions, not random cheer in the streets, that is, but parades that make time scroll back through movement. The past were actors, dressed as Roman emperors, walking along with the fully ceremonialized military, units in full armor, minstrels with unwieldy bronze horns, eunuchs holding censers molded as eagles, little aristocrats mouthing memorized acclamations that reverberated in the stone walls. The city was made into a platform for the eternal return of legitimacy. The emperor didn't appear on a balcony. He came out of the palace like a resuscitated myth. His cloak, alone, could be as heavy as 50 pounds, embroidered with images of Saint Michael and the Archangel. Holding the vigil over Constantinople, his boots left imprints in rose petals, which had been sprinkled along the palace path by attendants in white linen. He would ride horseback only when his health permitted. Otherwise, he stood in a chariot, resplendent with bronze panels depicting his own victories, drawn by snow-white horses laved in water scented with perfume. As the parade snaked through the city, bells tolled in a choreographed sequence, not all at once. In Blachernay, in the Forum of Constantine, at Hagia Sophia, this wasn't noise. It was sonic architecture. The sound of the route was mapped, and citizens stood as the empire unfurled, one toll at a time. Each chime signaled the emperor's pulse still living. The actual theater started inside the hippodrome, but this arena, originally used for chariot races, became a ceremonial coliseum of power. Senators, priests, generals, merchants, all of them sitting in their places of honor. Not just colored factions, blues and greens, but they are no longer sports teams, but ritual choirs. There, both groups of men shouted out pre-written verses in praise of the emperor's years on the throne, calling for victories, thinking the emperor could be forgiven past errors, occasionally even admonishing him against pride. These weren't spontaneous chants. They were rehearsed, written by court poets, measured by court ritualists, political sincerity in rhythm envelope. And then came the gifts. The emperor collected tribute from all over the empire, but he paid out more than he took in. Gold coins rained from balconies. Imperial eunuchs distributed bread to the indigent. Maas, H-style aid tents were erected, like those in the New Testament, recreating the miracles of Christ. The emperor did not love to receive. He distributed order. He re-impressed the social hierarchy, featuring generosity set up as an act of God's grace. When armistice was saluted, the style changed. not in awe, but in amplitude. They did not march as men, but as booty. Banners of enemies who had been defeated were held upside down. Captives were put on display, not in disgrace, but arrested in tableau, like chess pieces in the middle of capture. It was not for cruelty they were there. It was about contrast. The silence reaffirmed the emperor's chant-laden dominance. The triumphal entry had its own choreography. The unused Golden Gate was opened, hinges greased for weeks in preparation. The emperor rode in on horseback, and the officers who followed bore arms gilded with the cross. He disembarked at the Million, the 0 point of the empire, and proceeded shoeless, a vow of humility to Hagia Sophia, as well as a meticulously designed set piece to register the contrast with his former magnificence, that balance, glory, and piety was ritual logic at its best. He would kneel at the church, not alone, enclosed in a half-circle of soldiers and priests. From behind the marble iconostasis, the choir would sing from the Psalms, which were selected to reflect both conquest and mercy. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. In that moment, the emperor bowed as a man, bowed as a vessel. He didn't thank God. He let God be seen through him. But joy was not the sole purpose of ritual. That was how Byzantium metabolized catastrophe. When an earthquake hit Constantinople, knocking down statues, cracking domes, the reaction wasn't bewilderment. It was procession. The emperor went through the city on foot, accompanied by the bishops with their relics, icons, crosses. Residents converged, chanting Kyrie eleison over and over. The city was its own liturgy of lament. The earth shook, but the voice of the people responded more loudly. Hymns were written on the fly. Some were sung through the streets for days. That's how they changed, like oral scripture, as they passed from district to district until they came to the palace. When the emperor heard of them, they would be waiting for his response, not with orders, with presence. He stepped onto the balcony and stood quietly, bowed once, slow, and left. It was as if that single gesture were the empire's promise that everything would be all right. The earthquake soaked the rite in. The fires were a similar story. They were doused by chants and buckets alike. After that point, the affected areas got not only aid, but purification. Priests wandered through smoldering ruins with incense, singing psalms of purification. Symbolic numbers of new stones were placed. Churches rebuilt with offerings from the emperor's own private treasury, not from the goodness of his heart, but from ritual obligation. Renewal wasn't recovery. It was rebirth in the open air. When famine came, it turned into a theater of humility. Public fasting would be performed by the emperor. He'd cancel court banquets, eat coarse bread in an open square while eunuchs read from Isaiah. He would issue grain from the public granaries, but only in a procession. He strode in the middle, flanked by silent guards, his hand on no sword, because hunger wasn't just an index of economic failure. It was an imbalance in the liturgy, and ritual corrected it. Byzantium would not allow suffering to speak first. It drowned it in performance, and a ritualized response rendered fear manageable. What's more, it had turned chaos into choreography, and in doing so, it made the authority of the emperor appear inevitable, all the more so when he was weak, all the more so when the treasury had run dry, all the more so when the borders were in flames. It is why every imperial celebration, every public trauma, told a story. The point wasn't denial. The point was containment. A world too sacred to panic. A throne too holy to topple. Not because it could not, but because it always had a ceremony to right itself. There was no alarm to wake up the emperor that day. It started with waking up, not random, but by plan. The chamber was dark, even in the morning, for light had to be admitted in a certain manner. The head eunuch, who was versed in silence and rhythm, walked in punctually, carrying a lighted taper, chanting the first verse of the Psalms, "O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise." It wasn't just a wake-up, it was a consecration. The first words the emperor heard every morning were from Scripture. His bedchamber, usually placed in the Daphne or Chrysotriclinos complexes, was a microcosm sacred in itself. Walls lined with purple silk, ceilings of constellations painted on. At each corner facing the center map, there are icons. This wasn't a bedroom, it was a mobile chapel. When the emperor woke, it was as a man. He rose from a symbolic tomb, nightly regenerated as ruler. His robes were spread by eunuchs who had fasted the night before. Even they tiptoed up to the hanging fabrics to place their palms on them as if they were relics, not clothes. Dressing wasn't fashion, it was a rite. Layers were put together gradually, quietly. 8. White linen tunic, inner tunic, purity. Belting of red or green, authority or peace. A gold-threaded or purple outer robe was laid on him once he had said a brief prayer. Shoes came last, if he was going to be visible. Purple shoes represented divinity. Red, authority. A man who wore black had something wrong. A death, a drought, or an omen. His first act of the day, facing eastward, making the sign of the cross, and reading a brief personal liturgy, written for him alone, a strange hybrid of scripture and imperial oath. Then came the mirror, not for vanity, for verification, not to admire, but to ascertain that the image was whole, the image the empire demanded, mirrored in robe, stance, and poise. Breakfast was ceremonial, not because of the food, typically simple bread, honey, and watered-down wine, but because of the eating itself. The meal was brought in complete silence by the appointed eunuchs, in the form of trays bearing the seal of the imperial palace. Before touching it, the emperor was blessed by the palace chaplain. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he nodded. Either way, it was an early candidate to be the empire's first transaction of the day, a blessing of authority in return for a ritual obeisance. If he had officials to see after breakfast, they came in one after another. All gave a bow to a certain degree, according to their rank. Hands could not be extended. Eye contact was limited. No one sat except by invitation, and even then, only on stools, while the emperor himself was on a dais. Words were few, gestures were law. On some days, Whole court sessions were conducted with these choreographed silences, and eunuchs passing hand signals, gestures, and prepared words. Bureaucracy as ballet. Prayer punctuated everything. The emperor prayed 3 to 7 times daily, not always in church, occasionally in private chapels that are part of the palace, sometimes in front of a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, muttering to himself as a single candle flickered. The prayers were not random ones. They were written hundreds of years ago, passed along, committed to memory, performed like keys in a lock. If one was wrong, the day felt awry. Ritual had rhythm. Deviate, and it snapped. Walking was also formalized. The emperor did not stroll. He proceeded. Even within the palace, the guards were clearing paths. Everything he did had purpose. Corridor A could be used on big feast days. Corridor B on fast days. He couldn't just take a shortcut. If an emperor was observed to be walking a strange way, stories spread. Was he ill? Is there a crisis? Why break the pattern when the emperor entertained guests, nobles, generals, bishops? The topic determined the meeting room. War mosaics decorated rooms of military affairs. Painted domes looked down on theological debates. The setting itself was also a part of the message. Room decor wasn't for style. It was scripted subtext. They ate their meals in relays. The midday meal, usually enjoyed very privately or with a few nobles, was also served on jeweled plates. Each course was imbued with symbolic meaning. Fish was typical, an acknowledgement of Christian origins. Lentils during fast periods, meat for festive occasions. There was no idle chewing. Each bite reigned in a hushed regard. No clinking, no chewing sounds. Wine was diluted and blessed. Only some grades were privileged to drink water. After the meal, the emperor would sometimes go to the kubukleon, the private reception room. Here, the rituals became even tighter. He would perhaps receive petitions, folded letters deposited in golden bowls, scoured through by secretaries, and read aloud by an appointee. The emperor rarely read, and he listened, silent and still, as the decisions were reached with subtle nods of the head or small gestures of the hand. If he raised his finger to his forehead, it signified deferral. If he moved his foot, it was the bounce. Everything was signal. In the late afternoon, there was another habitual ceremony. The emperor would pass into one of the palace's quiet gardens, not to unwind. No, this was contemplation. These gardens were curated as though they were scripture, fig trees for knowledge, olives for endurance, and roses for divine mystery. He did not wander at will. He was put about by his silent attendants. A theologian could be allowed to speak, softly, briefly, quoting saints, never giving an opinion. The emperor took no advice. He received echoes of truth. As nightfall descended, the lighting altered. Darkness torches sprung to light, touched off by eunuchs draped in indigo-dyed robes, a nocturnal color of contemplation. Evening prayers began, sometimes in the imperial chapel, sometimes alone, always with music. If there was no choir, however, a single lyre might accompany the singing, or its strings might be tuned to the ancient Phrygian or Dorian modes of wailing or rejoicing. The sunset wasn't the only beautiful thing. It was a signal. Time for the emperor to start to descend into disappearing. He didn't sleep immediately. It was followed by a light meal, then another prayer. A eunuch burned incense from a bowl set at the foot of the bed before they went to the sleeping chamber. The smoke wasn't for aroma alone. It separated this world and the dream. The emperor made the sign of the cross once again, then lay down facing east. Curtains were drawn, doors locked, and a final chant was whispered outside. Lord, give peace to the guardian of the world. The emperor slept, silence around him now, trapped by walls that had seen thousands of years of the same motions. If he awoke in the middle of the night, a eunuch was on his feet. When he got up before dawn, so did the palace. Yet in everything, including fatigue, he was not merely a man resting. He was the unmoving center of an empire that revolved in measured orbits around his breath, and the next day it would start again. The Byzantine Empire didn't consider animals as animals. It saw them as metaphors, living hieroglyphs that walked, squawked, and every so often roared in a world written in symbolism. The imperial court had no pets. It had symbols with claws. A lion in the palace wasn't just an animal. It was Daniel's miracle in the flesh. A peacock did not strut. It was resurrected. No falcon was trained. It prophesied. Nature was good only when it followed the script. Animals within the palace presented themselves in highly controlled settings. Robots, of sorts, of the robot horse variety. Mechanical lions tended the thrones in reception halls, barking like dogs, rearing from crouch to lash out with hydraulic limbs and sprays of bushy hair. Their cadences reverberated through marble like voices of the gods. These weren't just tricks. They were message machines. A foreign ambassador, before, at the emperor's feet, in front of gold-coated beasts that growled in slow harmony. How could he help but feel like a moth before the sun? There were lions, real ones too, behind layers of enclosures, and tended by handlers who fed them sacrificially on public view. Feeding was an act of ceremony. Meat, lamb usually, was not tossed as sustenance, but as an act of staged capitulation. The animals roared and ripped flesh to remind everyone here was a world where chaos was chained, and the key was in the emperor's hand. Peacocks roamed freely in certain palace gardens, their tails spreading out like brush strokes of light. Their cries, inhuman, savage, were believed to be an approximation of the voices of angels. In private chapels, mosaics sometimes depicted them flanking the tree of life. No one ever shoot a peacock. To have done so would have been to insult eternity. White elephants, sometimes presented as gifts from India or Persia, were displayed infrequently, not because they were unwieldy to handle, but because they were too potent to use with abandon. When it was exhibited, it was a full state affair. The animal would be robed in gold-edged cloths, its tusks capped in bronze, and its entry laced with chants paraphrased from the Psalms. Sing to the Lord a new song. The clergy would intone, as though the creature itself was an answer to prayer. Falcons were employed in both the chase and for representation. When born by emperors, they signified sharpness and swiftness. and also invisible judgment, a falcon that the emperor let loose from his wrist in a public event was not hunting. It was a warning. Enemies beware. Eyes are watching. The bird did not come back until called by a gesture, an animate metonym of imperial justice, flying away, but never breaking orbit. To begin with, horses were in their own right considered sacred. The good ones were Arabians, bred for speed, trained in silence. The emperor's favorite horse was kept close to the palace and rubbed down each day with scented oils. On high feast days, its hooves were painted crimson, so that wherever it walked, it left the mark of blood-sodden feet. There was no cheering for the horse. They bowed to it, not in love, but in response to a choice. And there was the weather, not suffered through, but understood. Rain at the right time was a mercy. Rain in a bad moment was judgment. Priests read the sky as if it were scripture. If certain shaped clouds clustered together before a battle, companies doing it traverse routes to other company formations were delayed. The emperor would lead prayers out loud beneath leaden skies for clarity, not just in the weather, but in truth. At a time like this, a sudden sunburst was divine applause. Snowfall was also used in rare and dramatic ways as part of ceremonies. When it did snow in Constantinople, which was rare but could happen, children were assembled to create scenes that depicted the miracles of Christ, then to melt them all down. Early snowballers did not simply bombard each other. They molded the snow into doves and crucifixes. The emperor, when he showed himself outside, put white over his gold, the sign that the season was in harmony. Its melting was understood to be a process of cleansing. Rose water was being sprinkled on streets. The snow had done its part. The city had been washed. Eclipses were hazardous, not for their effect on light, but their effect on ritual. If the sun was eclipsed by the moon during one of its great feasts, it brought all to a standstill. Emergency litanies were led by the clergy. Trumpets sounded. The emperor was concealed within. To come forth beneath a darkened sun was to court the curious. Was God hiding his face? So ritual came to the rescue. Icons were covered, lamps lit early. The city became, in a way, blindfolded, waiting for the light to come back. When it did, bells tolled 3 times around the town. East, west, middle. Not all at once, but in series. This format repeated the Trinity. One sound, a second sound, and a third sound in harmony. God was not at odds with nature, but it had moods, and moods had to be served with rhythm, not fought. Even wind had protocol. In some processions, when the wind was high and it suddenly topped off the candles the clergy were holding in their hands, the ceremony stopped. The candles were not reignited at once. A prayer was offered. The wind was addressed. Spirit, clear a path for the light, they said, not metaphorically, but as a genuine appeal to a world of signs. When plague descended, animals turned into liturgical shields. Cats were considered purifying. They were kept in homes and admitted to churches. Their movements were watched. If a cat would not go into a building, the building was prayed over. If a dog barked at the palace walls at midnight, the guards didn't drive it away. They recorded it. To his eunuchs be attended. Brought to eunuchs the report, or the emperor could call for a vigil. Sound meant meaning. Animals meant omen. The empire's relationship to the seasons was no less ordered. Spring was topped with parades of children. As flowers carrying seed baskets, the emperor would pass among them, tossing coins that had been minted with plants instead of crosses. Summer was the season of military ritual, not only campaigns, but blessings of weapons, showings of horses, dances reenacting victories past. The autumn brought harvest festivals, but again, controlled and symbolic. Gold-lined bathtubs were pounded with grapes. Shaped bread, sea loaves, shaped in the form of shields, gifts to churches, not markets. And winter, the empire's most meditative season, featured fasts, low-register chants, and clothes that transformed from shining silk into darker velvets. The emperor wore darker reds, the empress, blue. The mosaics even appeared to have dimmed in the winter light. But this dimness was not rot. It was liturgical rest, as though it were a big breath. Before the spectacle of spring began anew, Byzantium did not merely inhabit the natural world. It mythologized it. It conducted the weather and animals as if they were instruments in a sacred score. A sign could be a crow landing on the palace wall, a flowering tree in the dead of winter, a miracle, a thunderclap in liturgy, a warning. These were not superstitions. They were notes in a holy manuscript that was still in the process of being compiled, day by day, candle by candle, hoofbeat by hoofbeat. A ruler, also, Byzantium did not simply die. He was beginning to leave the world the very way he had come into it, through layers of ritual, silence, and scented air. As soon as his breath slowed, the machinery of ceremony began to churn. Doctors were not called to act, but were present as witnesses. They didn't speak. They observed. The emperor's pulse was not taken with tools. It had been read by touch and prayer. A lag between the death declaration wasn't thought of as hesitation. It was homage. Life was not said over until the ritual was prepared to accommodate death. The room shifted the moment he put it aside. Curtains were drawn, incense lit, a cross placed on his chest. His name was not uttered, not at that point. The emperor was no longer the living center of the empire, yet until he had been publicly declared dead, he existed in ceremonial limbo. Death was announced only after the patriarch was notified. Once it was pronounced, the body was not washed in secret. Ritual washing was performed with prayers after every movement. The water was scented with rose and myrrh. When their clothing was taken off, every article taken off by the eunuchs was folded up and kissed. The body was re-robed, not in a night shift, but in imperial dress. The loros, the chlamys, the purple boots. A dead emperor more often resembled an icon than a corpse. He was taken to a temporary chamber, not the throne room, not the chapel, a room reserved exclusively for the dead, always lit, always cold. Candles surrounded him. Icons faced inward. Priests read psalms in shifts, non-stop, for the next 40 hours. The Book of Psalms was performed as a detergent against decay, not in body, but in spirit. No fly could ever get anywhere near a body that was protected by such a fortress of verse. The city, meanwhile, had ground to a halt. No public proclamations, no chariot races, no legal rulings. The empire did not merely grieve. It paused. The emperor had been time's fulcrum, and now time declined to rush. Then came the announcement. A eunuch, dressed in deep blue, passed through the chalky gate and intoned, "The servant of God, crowned in glory, has gone back to the Lord." Bells rang, not in celebration, not in sorrow, in acknowledgement. The people wept, but that weeping was choreographed. Women keened at appropriate places, and the men ripped off scraps of fabric from their tunics. Coins were put into street altars adorned with the dead emperor's face. Inside the palace, succession ceremonies were already in progress, even before the king's burial. The empire couldn't stand a vacuum. A new emperor was elected, usually standing by already, and crowned in a simultaneous ceremony. A corpse, cooled while another body sat under a candlelit crown. Continuity was never delayed. Byzantium mourned and began afresh in one and the same sigh. The funeral commenced at night, so that dawn would rise as the coffin neared Hagia Sophia. The emperor was laid in a sarcophagus of porphyry, bound with golden straps, and drawn by oxen covered with black velvet. No wheels screeched. The streets had been sanded into silence. Monks went on ahead with lanterns. Behind them came nobles and generals in two lines. It was formation that counted. Emotion didn't. Onlookers held candles. No torches. Candles meant resurrection. The wax melted in their palms and dripped like a prayer. No voices were raised. No music played. The only sound was the chant, deep, slow, antiphonal, rolling through the city like an undercurrent. Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy, over and over. At Hagia Sophia, the former king's body made its entrance unaccompanied, borne by clergymen, not soldiers. Within, the entire liturgy of the dead was sung in the imperial mode, a chant tone used only for emperors and saints. The patriarch gave no eulogy, only scripture, no praise, only the truth of mortality. All is vanity, he intoned, looking down into the coffin. Even kings are dust. The emperor had the crown taken from him, slowly, held aloft for all to see, then on the altar, never on another head. The dead emperor left his crown not directly. The next emperor sported a new one. Each crown is an era, a spirit of its own. Burial ensued, at times inside the Church of the Holy Apostles, at others in other dynastic mausoleums. They sealed the tomb with liturgy, not mortar. Prayers were intoned as the lid was closed. Psalms when the last torch was put out. No flowers. The waiting chamber was filled only with coins, icons, and prayer scrolls. The people were unable to witness the burial. It was hidden because the emperor hadn't disappeared. He went up into history, into memory, into mosaic, but it did not end there. Even after the burial, masses were said over the course of 40 days. Psalms were recited each night over an empty chair covered in imperial cloaks. Food given to the poor every day in the memory of the deceased. His name whispered in prayers every hour. Rest eternal grant unto him, O Lord. The empire wept, but the weeping had shape. Hagia, Sophia's mosaic, may be revised. The emperor built a line of memory made up of saints always standing, never sitting, always at his side. If the emperor had been loved, his face was made mild. If he had been feared, then his face was grim. But invariably, he was arch, idealized, part of the ceaseless parade of imperial images. What he remembered is now either unsilent oblivion or full awareness of being a saint. There were some emperors who were martyred and were later canonized, not because miracles had been done through their example, but because their lives fit the liturgical rhythm too neatly to wave away, their relics distributed, their names put on the calendar, their feast days celebrated with candles and imperial hymns. To the empire, death was not final. It was a recalibration, an instant when the machinery stopped, only to start up again, with one wheel switched out for another, the rest of the wheels still turning. And in those moments, Byzantium murmured to itself, even the sun sets with decorum. The first thing that struck you about life in Byzantium was not the emperor, it was the shimmer. Walls didn't sit quietly, they glowed. Gold leaf mosaics trapped and reflected the most tenuous candlelight and tossed it back as revelation. You walked into a room, not so much as entered an icon. Every surface was talking. Every inch said something, not for the function, but for eternity. Art wasn't hung. It was embedded. In stone, in plaster, in silk. Icons were not just images. They were presences, windows on the divine adjusted for spiritual efficiency. Every gaze directed, every hand gesture coded. A tilt of the head could convey mercy. The length of a finger might indicate warning. Even halos weren't generic, circular for Christ, starred for the Virgin, flamed for martyrs. You didn't just look, you read. And the emperor? He wore his meaning. His garments were winged theology. The loros, the ceremonial sash, wound around him like a coiled snake of power, long, sinuous, scintillating, with embroidered scenes of Christ Pantocrator or the resurrection. Each stitch could take days. Each thread was selected based not only on its shine, but on its symbolic density. Gold thread stood for divine substance. Blue silk represented imperial favor. Pearls weren't ornament. They were purity, crystallized. The chlamys, a less elaborate cloak, was for less serious times, heavily embroidered, but you could walk in it. It fell like water behind him as he walked, catching air and light. As he spun, it cracked in silent instruction. A moving tapestry, a wave of prophecy. Empresses, too, had their visual liturgies, their clothes as loud and bright as the Theotokos, Mary, Mother of God, imprinted with swaths of flowing lines and deep blues. Greob were most commonly edged with small crosses or stars. The higher the rank, the more motifs of stars, each referring to cosmic dominion. Their crowns were domed, not spiked, almost as if churches were being worn upside down. Many adorned themselves with strands of pearls that poured like rivers over their shoulders, part jewelry, part armor. Color was law. Purple, of course, was out, not a shade, but a state. It could not be worn, woven, or painted by anyone outside the bloodline. It was almost an offense to see someone else in it. Red was strength, but also danger. Blue was spiritual authority. Green for victory and rebirth. Black wasn't for mourning. It was for mystery. And white, paradoxically, wasn't just purity. It was transubstantiation, something that's taken out occasionally throughout the year and polished for when the emperor had to look like light turned into flesh. Sound was its own dimension. Byzantium didn't echo. It resonated. Spaces were built to accommodate the chant, as space might hold musk in perfume. Slowly, attentively, even the tiniest chapel could feel infinite if the appropriate hymn was sung. Chant was not just religious. It was tonal branding. The echoi, or musical modes, were associated with emotion, season, political climate. Mode I was stability. Mode 2 was lament. Mode Phi was royal. They weren't background tunes. They were sonic architecture. When the emperor entered Hagia Sophia, the choir shifted to his mode before he arrived. He had arrived. The people did not have to be told that. The air changed pitch. This kind of sound choreography also occurred in the hippodrome, where enormous choral ensembles would chant political slogans in ascending cadences. Sing it, but not with joy, as rhythmically asserting facts. Silence also had a role, where no sound was audible over a mic during a march. It was no accident. It was thunder withheld. An emperor, moving speechless among mortals, was a sign of terror, veneration, or celestial thought. The crowd didn't dare shout. They listened to the absence, and always beneath and beside all that was sent, Byzantium stank of God where it burned. Incense smoked continuously, not only in the churches, but in city staff offices, the private quarters of government officials, and even the hippodrome before the races. Each scent had a schedule. Myrrh on fast days, frankincense on feast days, balsam for coronations, storax resin when mourning. The smoke was more than cleansing. It taught. The nose entered the mind. Essence-soaked clergy robes were the cumuli of this vapor. Not by accident, by design. Priests were led through sweet-smelling chambers before performing liturgy to make sure their breath itself was sanctified. The emperor's robes were scented with recipes, so closely held they were guarded like state secrets. Cinnamon, rose, and resin, not to evoke sensuality, but sovereign dominion. Even the floors spoke. The choice of marble, based on acoustic reasons. Some parts of the palace were built using multicolored tiles, for reasons of beauty, and because they indicated zones. You did not cross certain patterns unless invited. Some stones were hauled in from particular territories because of their legendary status. A red porphyry slab from Egypt, a green serpentine tile from Sparta. The floor on which the throne was set wasn't tiling. It was geological theology. And beyond the palace, a language of sense persisted. Mosaics on city walls depicted stylized emperors blessing the wheat harvest. Fountains were molded in the forms of lions or crosses. Marketplaces resounded with singing. Merchants finding a way to sell grain to a tune of psalms. Even public punishment was a visual performance. Traitors weren't just exiled. They were carried in with their colors and their banners reversed. Let the crowd know why. The people didn't need to know. The verdict was the inversion. The elite wore personal icons, small triptychs suspended like necklaces or tucked into their sleeves. These weren't lucky charms. They were affirmations that you could fit in your pocket, that if a leader lost and his icon was not there, it could be viewed as a sort of divine abandonment. If he had come through with his life, he had obtained ritual absolution. Everything meant something. Everything was read. The visual, the audible, the tactile, all were melded into a complete sensorium. Byzantium did not speak only in words. It painted its laws. It sang its ideologies. It perfumed its truths, and in the process, it invented a world where message and medium became the same. The empire did not hold together because of its armies or its borders. It endured because it invented a language irresistible to disobey. In the Byzantine palace, a baby was no baby. He was a performance waiting to happen. He was part of a choreography older than his ancestors from his first breath. No nursery songs, no random affection, only ceremony, only expectation. To be born of the purple, porphyrogenitos, was to be born not into privilege, Doric says in his study, but into process. The purple chamber was not a metaphor. It was real, a womb in a womb, a room of imperial porphyry rock, so rare it was worth more than cities. An education that had once been more industrial was redirected from thinking with the first generation of thinkers, mainly themselves, to thinking with the people who had trained the first generation of thinkers, also mainly themselves. These were births that were timed to happen there, not for comfort, but for symbolism. If an emperor's child was born outside that room, whispers followed. If he was born within it, then stone and space elevated his legitimacy. Nurses weren't selected for their gentleness. They were selected for rank, discipline, and theological clarity. The first thing anyone said to the child was not a name, but Bible verses. Psalms were sung in lullabies. Icons hung above the crib. This was no random plaything. It was a miniature of imperial regalia, a golden cross, a tiny scepter, a globe, symbolizing the orbis terrarum. The world, he had been told, would revolve around him. Formal rites commenced at the age of 3. Not play, but performance. The child was instructed to bow before icons, to kiss the patriarch's hand, to keep still while he attended hour-long services. Every gesture was corrected. How a man should walk without scooping the heel. How to nod with imperial moderation, not eager, but never too slow. How to regard generals, how to regard eunuchs, how not to regard servants, unless it was unavoidable. At this point, in silence, the child was brought before the court. At age 5, he came into the chrysotriklinos with dwarfed purple robes, escorted by 2 eunuchs. No words were spoken. The seated emperor overhead nodded once. The court chanted a verse. The child bowed, then turned and exited. That was it, his debut. Thenceforward, he was a member of the ritual body of the empire. Education was immersive. Scripture memorization was normal. But so was ceremonial memory. He had to know the order of the feast days, the titles of the court officials, which gestures were appropriate for whom. He learned when to sit, when to kneel, when to weep, even when he wasn't sad. Feeling was never allowed to take precedence over form. Untriggered sorrow was insubordination. A joy that had no order was despair. Speech training was not about being original, but accurate. Children were drilled in the recitation of speeches of ancient emperors to make the tone, inflection, phrasing your own. If he was to become an emperor, he wouldn't be speaking his own words. He would echo the empire's memory. Art cannot be studied for beauty. It was studied for meaning. A painting of St. George wasn't liked. It was deciphered. The lance pointed down, victory. Upward, warning. Red background, martyrdom. Blue cloak, mercy. The child was trained to read the world visually and to be visually readable. When he was 10 years old, he had the diadem ceremony, not a coronation, but a practice run. On his head he wore a tiny gold circlet. He was led through the hippodrome in mute procession. The crowd didn't cheer. They bowed. The emperor walked at his side, not smiling, not guiding, but walking next to a younger self, already beginning to breathe in time with the future. He studied music, but not for fun. He researched the echoI, the liturgical modes, and how each one changed the mood of a room. He was trained to listen to the unheard, to recognize when a chant was a half step off, to know where a silence had stretched too long. If he couldn't tell the difference, he wasn't ready. He started his military observation at age 12. Not combat, ceremony. He saw the troops form up and break off in perfect time. He learned the code of salutes, the pleats of the parade cloak, the precise angle of spear tip. The battlefield is not where Byzantium won. It was where Byzantium showed that it had already won, with order. By the time he reached adolescence, the heir had become both student and symbol. His movements were copied, his garments inspected. If he limped, court physicians didn't just treat it. They looked at the way it would appear from the viewing balconies. Was not the emperor majestic, long-legged, without a limp? Fellers has a point in this respect, at least. Could a bent head indicate meditation rather than submission? The outside world was a rarity for him, and when he did, it was on screens, from balconies, in processions. The people didn't talk to him. They looked, and that look shaped him. He learned to keep his hand steady in benediction for 30 seconds. He learned to walk into a room and stop so that others could adjust their posture. Before he started to speak, love was controlled. He was not to marry at his own will. She would be chosen by ceremony, the bride show, a ritual beauty contest in which noble-born women paraded veiled and silent before the empress. The heir could decide, but only if it was one of the pre-approved options. Marriage wasn't union. It was alignment. Two signs combined to balance each other out. Errors were folded into training. If he laughed too loudly, the transgression was discreetly expunged. In soft tones, he was reminded that the people hear everything. If he cried in public, there was a special liturgy offered the next morning to account for the tears, to contextualize them in scripture. Nothing was accidental. Everything needed to be metabolized into meaning. Training intensified as he approached young adulthood. He had been forced to watch the emperor alone, in prayer, at the table, in sickness, not to comfort him, to study him. Even his father was a ceremonial text. How does the emperor breathe in private? Upon entering a chapel, what does he first regard? How does he come up from kneeling without looking rushed? For someday, all of those actions would be his. And when they were not his, they would be disqualified. Continuity was currency. Innovation was threat. And if he failed, the empire would not scold. It would absorb. He would be declared unready, a cousin, a brother, a nephew. There would be another chosen. The empire did not need him. It just had to keep up the performance. To this crown, only those who could walk in time were fitted. And from babe to man, the child of Byzantium was a stranger. He was rehearsed. In Byzantium, a dream was not a personal thing. It was a possible memo from the divine, especially if it was the dream of an emperor, or a monk, or now and then, an unlucky woman with the right timing. Dreams were shared, analyzed, and, if found to be meaningful, enacted. A vision could become policy. A nightmare might postpone a coronation. The unseen was never disregarded, because to disregard a sign was to break the choreography between heaven and empire. There was a palace office that interpreted omens. That's not a joke, and it's not meant symbolically. The imperial Oneropoulos, the dream reader, had his hierarchy, tools, and ceremonial space. He was not studying dreams alone, but the coherence of dreams with feast days, planetary conjunctions, and liturgical series. He didn't just ask, "What did you see?" He asked, "What day was it? What color were the clouds?" The antagonistic hymn sung yesterday we will refer to below. If the emperor had dreamed of a mountain splitting, the interpreter had not panicked. You looked at the architecture of the dream. A faulted mountain might signify heresy or a rebellion or a justified tear in doctrine. Blood that poured upward in the dream might indicate healing. If downward, civil war. There was a library of dreams of the past. Pattern recognition was problem-solving Zen, another nightmare of Justinian-esque proportions. That was why the patriarch had been called. But not all of the visions appeared at night. Others came through the city itself. A flock of birds dodging against the wind, a child reciting a verse from the Bible when he couldn't even read, a fig tree in full bloom in the middle of winter. These weren't dismissed. They were collected, noted by monks, led to palace without being permitted to speak. The emperor may not show it outwardly, but in private he'd call for a vigil, or a fast, or another march. Lest you think we didn't notice, we've responded. Comets were major events, not meteorology, theology. When one did, the palace announced that it would observe 3 days of altered liturgy. Processions were shorter, lights dimmer, no feasting. The emperor would enter Hagia Sophia, barefoot, carrying a candle, and say nothing, not a word. His silence was the empire's microphone, enough to wake heaven. There was a horrific deforming of solar eclipses, but they were possible to script. The palace had emergency rites, a scroll of the litany of cosmic interruption. Priests would chant, "If the sun is covered, set forth your mercy." Everyone stayed indoors. The city went dark in awe of itself, and when the light came back, Again, the emperor stood on the palace balcony, this time with a blessed loaf as he broke the bread for all. It was a clear message. Light is back, order is back. Thunder during a ceremony, interpreted. Only the emperor's candle went out when wind blew, interpreted. A deer near the palace walls, interpreted. Every event was filtered through liturgy, symbol, past omens. The empire did not believe in coincidence. It had faith in performance notes, some histrionic, some sly, all good. The messages of saints who appeared in visions were used as political weapons. A monk who said that St. George had whispered to him that the emperor was righteous would be called, not questioned, but be robed with fresh robes, be blessed and given a loaf of bread. His words would be quoted in the following hymn. If another self-proclaimed Saint Michael called for justice and the empire had just executed a general, that vision could be suppressed or reframed. The empire wrote dreams just as it wrote laws. In the monasteries, visions were currency. A monk may pen a whole book of dreams over the course of years, and aligned with shifts in politics. If two monks had a similar dream on the same night, the matter was considered very urgent, and every of the dreams was sent to the palace by way of ceremony parchment in red silk. The emperor did not read them directly. He had his ideal secretary, versed in languages, prophecy, and diplomacy. But not all visions were godly. Some were demonic. And for that too, the church had a script. If one of these court officials had said that a dark figure appeared to them in the night, standing at the foot of the bed and whispering uncertainty, the palace would have sent a priest to throw holy water around, bless the bed, and recite Psalm 90 for 3 nights. This wasn't folklore. It was protocol. You didn't reason with darkness. You contained it. Animals that appeared in dreams were significant symbols. Lions, authority, serpents, deception, eagles, divine judgment. Had an emperor dreamed of being lifted by an eagle, it would have been a sign of ascension. If the eagle released him during flight, this was a warning. The eagle had no need to say anything. Its wingspan spoke theology. Color, too, mattered. To dream in gold was a statement of affirmation. In purple, transition. In red, blood or change. Black was mystery or death, unless black was paired with stars, in which case it indicated revelation. Dreams were scored, like music, by their tempo and tone. Even relics spoke in dreams. An apparition of the true cross shone, bones of a saint humming with light. These dreams might inspire a public ritual. The relic could be taken out of its case, circulated through the city, re-blessed. People cried, not just of faith, but of confirmation. A dream had come true. The empire had listened. Some emperors were well known for their dream life. Constantine the Great, of course, whose vision of the cross in the sky entered into legend. Some, however, cultivated their dream reputations. They slept in special robes, in rooms painted with stars, near relics, facing east. Not for poetry did they journal their visions, but for pattern. One emperor maintained a clandestine volume of nightly symbols with the results noted down. That book had been kept in the palace library as though it were a treaty. And when emperors expired, their last dreams to the extent they were known, entered into their legend. He saw a city burning, and the dove was rising out of the ash. He talked about river running uphill. These weren't hallucinations. They were sacred footnotes, not truth, necessarily, but useful. If a dying emperor dreamed of a certain saint, for example, a chapel might be built in honor of that saint. Should he have dreamed about a meadow of white lilies, the empress would wear the flower for the next 40 days. Byzantium didn't distinguish between dream and ritual. It looped them together. Visions weren't disruptions. They were notes from a rehearsal in heaven. And whenever the empire heeded that advice, it lived. By the time the Ottomans took and named Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire was no longer doing any of its old choreography. The marble was cracked, the palaces echoing, the rituals slower, heavier, like a play losing its script. And still, as the walls crashed down and cannon smoke filled the air instead of incense, the ceremony would not end. The last emperor, Constantine the Phaeacian, did not flee. He robed himself in purple. He charged to war, not as a general, but as a relic, falling into a cloak of flames. No records claim he screamed. None of them report that he was leading the others in prayer out loud. He disappeared into myth, and the empire, it too, not with a bang, but with a curtain call. But Byzantium wasn't gone. It just changed stages. Its liturgies surfaced in the East in Russia. Tsars' crowns haven't been the only sort that was political. They weren't real. They were ceremonial royal children of the Byzantine regalia. The idea of divine monarchy draped in velvet and fire was adopted by the Russian court. Icons multiplied, processions lengthened. The liturgy, echoing domes, resounding to its song, beat time to the rhythms traced there in Constantinople. The Ottomans would adopt the ritual architecture as well. They didn't raise Hagia Sophia. They repurposed it. The Sultan came in without speaking. Yet the light continued to filter through the dome as sacred geometry. The room still seemed to reverberate with the sort of echoes that whispered Byzantium's ancient secrets. The way in seemed appropriative, triumphal, measured, almost liturgical, a metaphor for the empire that had just come to grief. In the western half of the empire, Catholic and Orthodox rites still prevailed. Icons of gold leaf, processions around altars, the smell of myrrh on vestments, and with each of those movements, Byzantium gasped again, not as memory, muscle memory. The priest lifting the chalice in a high liturgy isn't reflecting on Constantine VII's Book of Ceremonies, but he's doing it, line by imperceptible line. The echoes persist, even for the relatively secular, nowadays, military parades. The flags flying at some angle, the sun-glinting troops lining up at a pop beat, the heads returning so slowly only command of arms could induce a belated glance. Our ritual theater cut from Byzantine DNA. Presidential inaugurations, royal coronations, funeral marches. They're not there just to honor power. They show it, wrap it, hawk it in studiedly intentional loops. Byzantine architecture, too, bears the mark. Domes raised to defy gravity, maze-like inlays of marble and divinity. Not spaces meant for motion, but for pausing, for wonder. We enter these buildings, modern and skeptical, and yet we still lower our voices, still look up. Byzantium is even elusive in digital life. When a leader shows up for a few big moments, when silence is favored over speech, when symbols, flags, gestures, bespoke suits shout louder than policy, that's not spin, that's ceremony. Byzantium's ghost in a new cloak. The genius of Byzantium wasn't in its armies or even its theology. It was in what he learned, that reality warps to rhythm, that all people will follow beauty out of more of the world than they will follow command, that when there is no truth to rock, the ritual can still stand. And so, the ceremonial mind persisted. Whenever a bell is rung, signaling a change, each time a candle is lit before a name is uttered, each time a robe has been seen not to soothe, but to send a message, and to goad and saunter and strut, on cue in silence as others watch. Byzantium is there, not as empire, as echo, as a performance too perfect to overlook, as choreography so old it can't be cancelled, like the silence before the curtain goes up, and perhaps, just perhaps, as the sound that still whispers by candlelight under domes, behind thrones, across centuries. Everything that is holy is also timely.